Hello, welcome back everyone. My name is Drew. I'm an exercise physiologist and Chinese medicine practitioner and have been studying and practicing breathwork for over 25 years now when I first used it to recover from chronic fatigue syndrome. And in today's video, we were talking about breathwork for cancer. This is coming from a question from Ryan, who I know works with cancer patients, and he is using breathwork techniques to help manage the patients he's working with. And so just wanted a bit more information on what's the role of breathing exercises or breathwork for cancer. So let's get into it, shall we? So there's lots of different kind of forms of cancer, but usually when we're talking about breathing, we're talking usually either about lung cancer particularly, and Ryan's question was about the scarring that happens in lung cancer, and how that affects breathing. So we'll look at some of the studies and we'll break down some of the actual kind of anatomical issues that we need to be aware of with breathing and breathwork for cancer patients. So here we have alveoli in a healthy lung, so the little air sacs. So this big branch here, this is the bronchial tree. So this is where the air comes down when you inhale, and it comes into these it's kind of like a grapes. Think of like a bunch of grapes with air sacs. And so this is an individual alveoli here. And so when you get the air in, we want to have gas exchange. We want to have oxygen coming in from the air we breathe in, which goes into the blood. So this is called the respiratory membrane. And so we have diffusion, so oxygen goes from the air in the alveoli into the blood, and then at the same time you're getting carbon dioxide releasing into the alveoli to be exhaled. Okay, and there's a couple of really cool gas mechanisms that happen there. But essentially that's what's going to happen at the respiratory membrane. In various forms of COPD and cancer, what we have is thickening of the alveoli wall, and a lot of scarring, and that essentially means that the inflation, so you can imagine like each time you blow up a balloon, the alveoli expands because you're getting more gas in there, so there's an expansion, and then as you exhale there's a kind of retraction as the air leaves, and so there's an elastic component to the lungs. So one of the big issues with kind of COPD and scarring is that you lose that elasticity, so the air is not going to diffuse properly. You're not going to get that diffusion, and you get trapped air in the alveoli. So basically you get little pockets of air that get trapped, and then you can get an accumulation of CO2 and or oxygen in the alveoli. So you're just not getting a proper breath in and a proper breath out. Now that compliance issue, so compliance is kind of like the ability of the ribs and the thorax to expand on the inhale and then retract on the exhale. So that lung compliance reduces, and you kind of the amount of air you get in is depending on how much the volume you can change in the lungs. So as you contract the diaphragm in the intercostals, they spread the ribs apart, and that kind of creates this kind of increased volume, increased space, and then the air gets drawn in. Through changes in atmospheric pressure, because air will move from a state of high pressure to low pressure. So when you breathe in, you're kind of dropping the pressure in the lungs, okay, as the container expands, and so atmospheric air will move into the lungs. Okay, but when you've got this kind of scarring and lack of compliance, you're not getting that movement, so you can't draw as much air in as much or air out, and that has implications on the gas exchange and diffusion of the molecules in and out of the lungs. So that's the basic kind of mechanism. So it will depend on the type of cancer people have, and there's really two ways you're looking at breathwork with cancer. There's cancer related to specific lung conditions, and then there's cancer related to other systems in the body, other organs. So for example, like a liver cancer or a lymph cancer. Okay, so one cancer affects the actual lung organ itself directly, and the other cancer is more systemic or other parts of the body. So there's kind of two ways we approach breathwork with cancer. Now the literature and the research in breathing exercises for cancer is kind of still fairly new, because breathwork itself in the zeitgeist, in the kind of the fitness world is really quite popular, but everything moves very slowly in the research world, and so we're starting to get some kind of good evidence coming up now, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done. Okay, so this is probably the go-to study I'd recommend people look at. It's a scope review on breastwork for breast cancer patients. Okay, so this is not someone who's got cancer in the lung. This is cancer of the chest muscles on the breast. So this is done in 2025, so this is about as recent as it gets, looking at 16 random controlled trials involving 1,700 women with breast cancer. And they found that breathwork interventions, including yoga, qigong, which is my particular breathwork practice, and other breathing techniques significantly improve mental health and quality of life. So often what you'll find is breathwork is used as an adjunct to cancer treatment. So that includes all the pharmacological treatments, chemotherapy, radiotherapy, psychotherapy, and also exercise therapy or pulmonary rehab or oncology rehabilitation, which is there's a lot of research in kind of oncology exercise, and it's definitely a big part of the treatment strategy now. So key outcomes in this scoping review: yoga-based interventions with breath work, where you have 50% breath component. So when you're looking at yoga and Tai Chi and Qigong, there are kind of like the movement practices, and then there's just the seated breathwork practices. So in yoga, you would have yoga asana, which is the movement or the stretching component, and then in Qigong you would have the forms or the movement, and then the actual seated practice is just called qigong breathing. The seated breathing practice in yoga is called pranayama. Okay, and in another study, like if we look at this study here, if I go to this one here, we'll jump into this one here. Effects of different components of yoga and metasynthesis. This is a really cool study. So this is a meta-analysis of meta-analysis. So essentially a meta-analysis is where they take random controls trials and then they review all the information in the random control trials. So you might have 60 RCTs and they collate all the information and the kind of what's happening and what the evidence is, and they report on that big body of evidence. Now a metasynthesis is basically the same thing but on a group of meta-analyses. And so this one here, I believe they had 16 different meta-analyses in yoga. So that might be yoga for mental health, yoga for cancer, yoga for diabetes, yoga for blood pressure, meta-analyses. So yoga is really, really quietly, highly studied. And what we kind of find when you dig down into the kind of the yoga studies is that when you integrate the movement practice, so the yoga asana, with breathing practice, pranayama, with the relaxation practice, which in yoga would be savasana or resting pose, when they're integrated with the ethical considerations, so yamas, niyamas, they're found to be stronger quality and more efficacious, as in like it works better. And that certainly is reflected in the kind of classical teachings of yoga. Same thing in Qigong and Tai Chi, because in Qigong and Tai Chi practice you have movement practice. So in Qigong it's the forms, in Tai Chi it's the forms. So like a classic Tai Chi practice is Yang style Tai Chi, it's probably the most popular practiced form. And in Qigong you might have the 8 brocades, so 8 movements, 8 moving forms of breathing. Then you have pranayama for yoga, and then qigong seated practices or just standing zanzong practices for qigong. Then you have deep relaxation in both yoga and in qigong. And they both have kind of lifestyle intervention modification built into the program. So like the kind of ethics, so things like eating well, maintaining good relationships, being of service, finding purpose, intentionally regulating your mind and emotional states on purpose. So really a holistic kind of integrated approach, and that really kind of shows that when those programs are done, the results are pretty good. Now the trick is like doing the actual research when you're integrating all those different components is really, really quite difficult. It's very hard to do from a research perspective, but we kind of know intuitively and just from personal experience, it's like it's not one thing, it's the lifestyle approach. So this is basically what they're saying here in the scoping review. So when the different practices are integrated correctly, we tend to get better outcomes, which is what we want. Okay. We get improvements in fatigue levels and treatment-related weight gain. So what big part of with any kind of cancer treatment is, as part of the treatment, going through radiation, chemotherapy, all the kind of the drugs, if you will, fatigue is a big issue. So managing fatigue is really good, and I got into breathwork through having chronic fatigue, not cancer, chronic fatigue, and so I can kind of test to how focusing on breathing can increase your energy, and that really comes down to being able to deliver oxygen to the tissues and to the cells efficiently, and then regulating the blood gases, so you're getting diffusion from the lung to the blood, and then diffusion from the blood into the tissues and the cells. And how you breathe has a huge impact on that kind of diffusion. Okay. Breathwork has been found to be safe and accessible. Okay, really important. So particularly because everyone's walking around with their breathing tool, their lungs and their diaphragm, you can do it anywhere. The techniques themselves are fundamentally quite simple. When you get into really integrated practices like Tai Chi, qigong, and yoga, and you can get really quite complex practices. But on the aggregate, a lot of the research uses very simple, straightforward protocols. So it's very accessible. It's very safe. But the challenges include inconsistent adherence to at-home practices and variability in intervention protocols. This is a huge problem. So in research, we kind of know what works, to be honest. Like we kind of already got it pretty much figured out. And a lot of research is like teasing out the minutiae and the best way of doing things, or trying to understand in a deeper level the mechanisms, like the physiology, the biochemistry, the neuropsychology, about how these things work. Because when we understand how it works, it provides us more reinforcement and encouragement to keep practicing and doing the thing. Okay. But essentially, like if you want to get fit, we know what you need to do. 150 minutes of exercise a week, lift some weights, drink mostly water, have good social interaction, and if you do that for 80% of your focus, then we can argue about all the sets and reps and the protocols and et cetera, et cetera. So always start off macro, and then you can kind of fine tune as you go along. Okay. Big problem in the research in yoga and in qigong and in tai chi is this heterogeneity. So there's so many different variations and styles and protocols. It's really, really hard to say which one is doing what, because there's the replicating the studies is difficult, because you have different yoga lineages. So for example, you have Chris Mancharian lineage. So he's basically the founder of modern yoga, if you will. And then from Chris Mancharia, he had 3 students. So he had Gary Carstyle, who went off and did Vini Yoga, which is kind of yoga therapy. He had the Ashtanga guy, so he went off and did the Ashtanga one, which is a lot more classically the stronger practice. And then you had Iyengar, who then, because of a back injury, he went into more of like a rehabilitation kind of yoga. So you have kind of like a yoga therapy, a kind of fitness, health, conditioning yoga, and then you kind of got one in the middle, which is kind of like yoga for health and wellness and kind of more rehabilitation type stuff. Of course, I'm simplifying. They're a lot more complicated and more in depth than that, so don't come at me, yogis. Same thing in Tai Chi and Qigong. So essentially in Tai Chi you've got 5 primary styles. So you've got Yang and Chen are the 2 main ones, and then you've got Sun, Hao and Yin style, and then you've got North and Southern China, different kind of styles. You've got Wudang Tai Chi, and then you also have all the Shaolin systems as well. So you have lots of different variabilities and different kind of practices and styles. So from a research perspective, it's kind of hard to tease out what's going on. But if you go back to that study, this is what this study was trying to do. It's like tease out the differences in all the different yoga practices and see what they're doing, if they can kind of find any kind of threads. We haven't got time to go into this paper today. We might do a full kind of video this in the future. If you do want me to do that, put a comment down. Say, hey Drew, can you do a video on that paper, because it's a really, really good one. It's really interesting. It's very, very hard to do this kind of work. So hats off to the researchers who did this study. Okay, so let's move on. So next one we got here is yogic breathing for breast cancer survivors. So this is pretty cool. So this is a pilot study. They're rolling out a full study. So a pilot study is like a small one you do before you do the big study, just like test things out, see if things work. So they're doing a 12-week study using a telehealth app called Kumbi. I haven't actually used it. Guiding participants through 3 10-minute breathing sessions daily, 5 days a week. So 10 minutes of pranayama sessions daily, and then you do that 5 days a week. So you're doing about 30 minutes of pranayama a day. You're going to be using an app, and then it's a follow-along practice that you would do at home. This is really interesting because apps are a really, really important part of our toolkit. And adherence, if we go back to the previous slide, one of the big things is trying to get people to do consistent at-home practice. So how do we keep encouraging people to do the thing? All right, that's the point I was trying to make there. We know often what the thing is, like the exercise, prescription, whatever. But when we're trying to get people to do it, being really consistent is really, really important. And that's one of the biggest themes you'll get across in all exercise research, is there has to be this kind of consistency, keep turning up, keep showing up, get your reps in. And because you can have the best protocol, the best program, but if people don't actually do it, then it's kind of, it doesn't matter. All right, so how do we help people practice at home? Because you can be in the clinic, you can be with the therapist in the clinic, the exercise physiologist, the physiotherapist, the practice nurse, whoever, and you have that kind of engagement and accountability in your one-to-one space. But when you're on your own and no one's there watching you and no one's there making you do it, okay, how do we encourage people to engage? It's really, really tricky. It's kind of like the golden ticket, the Willy Wonka golden ticket. If anyone can kind of crack this code in health space, they'll make billions of dollars. And there are some great companies out there who are really pushing into more behavioral change psychology. So how do we understand how people make decisions, and then how do we encourage them to make the right decisions? And then as we're moving into the AI technology and apps are becoming more prevalent, we have to have apps that are well made and have good efficacy behind them, and also support all the science of why they're there. So this is pretty cool. I'm looking forward to see how this study turns out. But in their pre-study, the participants reported reduced stress, anxiety, and sleep disturbances with improved quality of life. So we know how important sleep is. So sleep is where healing, rest, recovery happens. So that's super important. Big component when people are going through cancer, either treatment or post-cancer, is just managing stress and anxiety, because there's always that fear in the back of the mind it's going to come, or if you're during the treatment, it's very stressful. And we know there's a lot of research on the benefits of breathwork or breathing exercises to manage the stress response. So essentially what happens there is that breathing and heart rate are closely linked together via respiratory sinus arrhythmia. And then that's connected to the autonomic nervous system. And so if you intentionally regulate your breathing, you can then influence the state of the autonomic nervous system and down-regulate a stress response, assuming they feel psychologically and physically safe. If someone doesn't feel psychologically and physically safe, their stress response will still be elevated. Okay, so you've got to get people comfortable, build trust, build rapport, and explain what they're doing so they understand it, so they have some kind of buy-in and some kind of autonomy, and then you can introduce it. You just don't kind of give these people these things without that, and otherwise it could backfire and make people more stressed and more anxious. In this study, they're looking at reductions in inflammatory biomarkers, so things probably like salivary cortisol. So these are kind of markers of stress that you can kind of take a swab, and in this study I believe they're using fingernail clippings, and they're analysing for levels of stress hormones and cortisol that is released when you're in a stress position. Their preliminary data suggests yoga breathing could lower these biomarkers, potentially improving cancer outcomes. So the concept here is that The overarching concept with breathwork is that you're regulating the stress response. If you can get people more parasympathetic into the healing space, that's going to help facilitate rest, recovery, healing, in conjunction with other therapies. So if they're always stressed, it's going to be hard for them to engage the healing space in their body. Okay. Breathing exercise for pain management in cancer survivors. So pain can be a big issue depending on the type of cancer and where it is. So we have a 2023 systematic review of 10 studies examining breathing exercises for chronic pain in cancer survivors, particularly breast cancer. Key findings: slow pursed lip breathing showed benefits for post-surgical pain relief. So that means basically you're inhaling through the nose and then exhaling through the mouth, controlling that breath, pursed lip breathing. Now, you've probably experienced this. If you stub your toe and you've got sharp pain, you use breathing to kind of like blow it off, blow the pain off. It's a similar thing like that as well. It's also going to be slow-paced breathing is going to regulate the nervous response. Slow, deep breathing and he-who, regular breathing were effective for pediatric cancer patients. So basically that's kind of like a sigh breath. Hey, hey. And that slows the exhale. In Chinese medicine, that hu-hei sound regulates the heart qi, or the shen on the spirit, and it's very calming in Chinese medicine and qigong practice. It's a very calming breath. So when you're doing that for pediatrics or kids, it gives them something to engage in. So the sound gives them something to engage in, so it's able to kind of like anchor their mind more. However, techniques like active cycle or breathing techniques and 5 minutes mindful breathing showed no significant pain relief. So active cycle breathing, so you're thinking like things like Wim Hof and mindfulness breathing, where you're just sitting quietly and watching your breath, but you're not changing respiratory rate, depth, or rhythm, didn't really change pain. And the reason for that is because you're not activating the neural circuits that's going to down or regulate the limbic response in the brain, and you're also not activating the kind of autonomic nervous system to switch into parasympathetic. Okay. If you're doing hyperventilation breathing early on, it might help you to regulate gases in the system, so kind of outgas excessive carbon dioxide. But if you keep doing that, you'll create a stress response in the body. If you do Wim Hof breathing techniques, is really good and it's quite appropriate. You can regulate the stress response if you do the full practice. So it's hyperventilation breathing plus slow paced breathing plus meditation and relaxation and plus the cold immersion. So when you combine those together, it's a different practice entirely. But just ventilation breathing on its own would be counterproductive. I wouldn't recommend it. So definitely quality of life improvements in some studies, but evidence was preliminary. So this is a systematic review. So again, 10 studies, so that's a great start, but we need more. Also, no adverse events reported in one study addressing safety. So there's one study particularly that was looking at safety. So that's good. It's quite safe. So breathing exercises, you can begin to do it kind of anywhere. It's very safe. It's portable. So there's lots of benefits to breathing exercises. Then we get into non-pharmacological management for idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. So IPF is basically where people get that scarring in the lungs, and idiopathic means is like we don't know why. It just starts to happen. Currently working with one client who's got IPF, and we're doing qigong practice, and she's already reporting feeling better. Okay, you're not going to fix this, you're not going to reverse it. Unfortunately, once the lungs are scarred, it's kind of irreversible. If that's not the case, please let me know, but that's my understanding. So what we're doing is managing quality of life. So there's two real steps to this. There's oxygen therapy, so that's where you'll see people carrying the oxygen bottles around and the little kind of face masks. So they're delivering oxygen at a higher concentration into the nose. Okay, now that's great, and often you'll see people be able to, like I've got a client we'll do exercise with, and she might come in with O2 stats in 85, which is quite low. We put her on supplemental oxygen. We get her O2 stats back up to 93, and she's doing nothing. She's just sitting there. So that can be great. Now, if you can teach people how to breathe properly, and this is what we've done with this particular client. So she's got a lot of scarring. She has not idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. She has, oh my God, I'm having a total mind blank. COPD with all the scarring, associated with lots of smoking. Oh my God, I'm having a total mind blank. Anyway, you guys know the one I'm talking about. It's the most common one. I'm gonna have to Google it. Oh my God, what is it called? Emphysema. There we go. I triggered my mind. So she's got emphysema as a result of smoking. Doesn't have cancer, but she's got all that scarring that we were talking about previously. So she's got all this scarring here, quite significant scarring in the lungs. So lacks lung compliance. And one thing you can see with these people is they have quite a barrel chest because there's not a relaxation phase, because the alveoli aren't reducing in size. They're staying inflated, if you will, or hyperinflated. So they often have these very big barrel chests. Anyway, so oxygen therapy is really helpful, but if we can then teach you how to breathe correctly, the key thing I do with this client is teach you how to fully exhale and mechanically exhale. So we're relaxing as much as possible to help close those alveoli down and push mechanically any trapped air out as much as possible. And then introducing slow kind of breath hold techniques and slow exhalation techniques to regulate her blood gases more. And that way we can kind of get a bit more diffusion, a bit more oxygenation of tissues. And having done that for a long time, you can now do a good 45-minute exercise program quite well and manage it quite well, which is great. So oxygen therapy is really important. Clearly you need to work with your doctor and your pulmonary specialist to get onto oxygen therapy. It's not just something you can access. And then we also have pulmonary rehabilitation. So the problem here is you get into these vicious cycles of deconditioning. So the more breathless people are, the less they do, which results in this kind of perpetuation of deconditioning. Downstream consequences of that include dyspnea, so being out of breath a lot on exertion. So basically simple things like getting up on the couch and going to the kitchen, you're out of breath. Try and put your clothes on, you're out of breath. Transporting from the car to the post office, walking 10 meters, you're out of breath, that kind of stuff. Okay, so you're easy to fatigue, and that comes with a lot of psychological consequences in the form of anxiety and depression. And so if we can then teach people breathing exercises, one to regulate their blood gases, and then also to help manage that kind of stress response psychologically, it can be a huge, huge bonus for them. So this is taken from the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation. Okay, so if you just Google Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation, you'll find this little diagram, and this is a nice little flow chart here. So we have pulmonary fibrosis leads to breathlessness, leads to deconditioning, leads to fatigue, leads to less activity, leads to social isolation because you don't want to go out because everything makes you fatigued and you feel horrible, and then you get anxiety and depressed, and your emotional, mental health, well-being decreases. Pulmonary rehabilitation has been shown consistently to recondition someone, so you get improved quality of life, so they get integrate back into society, so they get a bit more empowered. They have practices that they can do to help manage their problem or their condition, particularly with education, so they understand why they're doing it and how to do it and when and where to do it, and then they can exercise safely, and then they have control or a locus of control or a semblance of input or a say in what they're doing, and that improves their quality of life. And this is really one of the key things we want to do, is give people a little bit of ownership of their health. Okay, so in pulmonary rehabilitation, so we do exercise training, so that can be all major muscle groups essentially, where we teach the people the exercise techniques, so squats, push-up, heel raises, walking, gentle weights. Okay, the exercise prescription itself is a very kind of fundamental. So large muscle groups, we don't tend to do so much isolation exercises. We measure and monitor oxygen saturation. So if it drops below 90 during exercise, we tend to then rest. So rest is kind of based on oxygen saturation. And then we do breathing exercises kind of during exercise. So teaching people to breathe in and out with the movement. So it's like you're doing a push-up, you're going to breathe in on the in phase and out on the X phase to match the biomechanical kind of principles of breathing. And then also during the rest phase, we are breathing in through the nose and out through the mouth to outgas carbon dioxide, which will build up. And then we go in through the nose, out through the mouth, to then in through the nose, out through the nose. Okay, so we then slowly kind of rebalance the gases. When they feel like their shortness of breath is under their control, then you go into the next set. So it's really subjective to the person's experience, to their exertion, and then you manage the client from that perspective. Then we might give disease-specific education around the scarring and the mechanics and why we're doing the things we're doing, so they understand it. And then we have the psychosocial support. So if you have ever been in a situation where you feel very breathless, like you're suffocating, it's very stressful. And so when people are doing exercise, if they've got breathing conditions, it can actually be very stressful because they feel like they're going to suffocate, which is not a nice, pleasant feeling to have. So lots of social support around that. The goal is to reduce symptoms, optimize functional status, increase participation in daily life, and improve the psychological well-being. Okay, so we want to tick all those boxes. Okay, so if you have kind of issues with your lungs, you can kind of go to the Australian Lung Foundation. They've got a lot of great resources there. You can go to the Pulmonary, so let me jump onto, so Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation here, so which is where we got this slide from. Then you can also jump on Exercise Sport Science Australia. We've got white papers there on exercise guides to oncology for cancer, particularly. There's a whole white paper on exercise oncology. And you can also then find exercise physiologists through Exercise Sport Science Australia, which is our website. So if you're in Aussie and you want to work with a highly trained exercise physiologist, so university trained, usually 4 years, and then specialist training on top of that, if you're doing particular pulmonary rehabilitation, then you can kind of source and find EPs. We're a growing band in Australia, which is fantastic to see. Okay, so I hope that answers some of your questions. If you have any questions around breathwork and cancer, please feel free to reach out, contact me. You can drop a comment down below. Always happy to answer comments or point you in the right direction. The key takeaway here when we're working with cancer is 1, manage the mental health. 2, manage the stress response. 3, biomechanical breathing techniques, so you're getting efficient breathing where possible. 4, managing the gas exchange, so understanding how to inhale, how to hold the breath, how to exhale, hold the breath, and when to do that appropriately. Managing the stress response, managing oxygen saturation, okay, and then building up a long-term program that someone can follow that is simple, safe, and effective. Okay, simple, safe, and effective is the best. You can prescribe really complex breathwork protocols to people, but in my experience, simple is best. And unless you kind of get someone who is super engaged and they want to go down what I call the rabbit hole and really explore a lot of the complex breathing exercises, because in qigong and in pranayama we have very complex protocols that you can use. And one of the key things in this scoping review, no, not this one, sorry, it was in the this paper here, Yoga as an Intervention of Stress, meta-analysis, that was like 60 something papers, and was it this one? Yeah, the meta-synthesis is that integration. of the protocols. So movement, breath work, relaxation, meditation, and then ethics. If someone wants to go down a rabbit hole and really explore all that, then you'll need a good coach, a good teacher, a good yoga instructor, a good qigong master. And a qigong master is just someone who has done a lot of training in qigong. It's kind of like, there's not really a belt system in the Chinese systems. You basically, once you get to a level, you get certificates in China and all this kind of stuff like that. But it's not really, it's not a regulated field. Okay, so the word master is kind of, in the West we don't tend to appreciate that too much. But if you have the title of master and you come from a lineage in China, like, that's a big deal. So just something to think about. But anyway, so you want full integrated practices is what I'm saying here. So you want to find someone, a good teacher, who understands how to build up a full protocol for you and guide you through that. And if you can find that, because it's the problem with Western interventions is we just separate everything out. So you go to one person for your exercise, one person for your mental health, you go see the doctor for this, and you go see, the 5 other specialists, and they're all really important, but then everyone's busy, no one's talking to each other, it's really hard to integrate. So the power of Chinese medicine, the power of yoga is that it's fully integrated as well. And we're seeing a lot of research now, it's kind of integrating Western approaches and Eastern approaches, and we kind of starting to marry them together, which is super cool. Okay, so it's really important. You've got to find a good teacher, a good instructor, a good EP, someone you connect with who can guide you through the process. Okay, because I've been training myself for 25 years. I've currently got 3 teachers. I'm still training, I'm still learning, I'm still practicing, and that's all part of it. As they would say, as Musashi, who's one of the classic Japanese samurai, is just like, once you get on the path, you just keep going. Find your path, keep going. Okay. All right. Okay. And I'll leave it there. Like, share, subscribe, questions. You know what to do. See you next one.